Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast. In this first podcast, we're pleased to share our chat with Jos Akkermans, Associate Professor of Sustainable Careers and Organizational Behavior at VU University in Amsterdam.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'd like to introduce you to our listeners. This is Jos Akkermans, who is an Associate Professor in Sustainable Careers at the very unpronounceable VU University of Amsterdam, which literally translated means the Free University of Amsterdam.
Actually, you pronounced it perfectly.
Oh, thank you. Well, I will keep on trying to apply my intercultural knowledge to these things, but I wasn't sure that would work. Anyway, Jos agreed to talk to us this morning because we have a lot in common in terms of the way we work on understanding careers, how to make them better. And I've got a lot of questions to ask him, and I'm hoping that he's going to be able to share some great insight from the work he does, both as a professor and, of course, from his own story. So why don't we start, Jos, with a very simple question. What first attracted you to the idea of focusing on careers at all in your work?
That's immediately an interesting but also tricky question, right? How do you end up in the area you end up in? Well, I guess for me, I was kind of fascinated by the idea of how careers are different for different people. So I think quite early. So I grew up in a very small village, and I have a very big extended family. But I was actually the first one to go to university, so I got to see a completely different world and completely different world of careers. Basically, once I went to Utrecht and study. I'm seeing it now in Amsterdam as well, and I think I was fascinated by the fact that some people finish education at age 16 and then go on to work until 65. Other people study until they're like 25 from higher education. They finish university and then sometimes even study more years, like if you want to be a doctor, for example, or an accountant. So I was fascinated by the idea of how these completely different pathways emerge in people's careers, and how everyone tends to find their own path, but not everyone is successful at it. And I guess that kind of already triggered me during my studies to think about, for me, what would be a good career for me to have, but also looking around and seeing other people crafting their careers in completely different ways. And that, like, the idiosyncratic part of it really fascinated me, I think, from my studies on.
So you initially chose to study psychology as your first undergraduate degree in the many degrees that you've subsequently gained. What drew you to that, particularly as the first child in a larger family to be going to university, coming from a small village in, I'm guessing, somewhat rural Holland?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. You've told us a little bit about this idea that we all have such different paths, and it's difficult to predict and understand exactly what might make it spark or not spark. But what fundamentally drew you to understanding more about people?
Well, actually, that's a pretty interesting story from the idea of the research that I'm doing, but we'll talk about that later, I think. But I think it relates closely to the research on career shocks that I'm doing right now, because I would say I'm a very highly conscientious person. I like to plan things and like to set goals and act on those goals. And I'm someone who likes to, I wouldn't say play it safe, but I don't take like the biggest risk, like tomorrow I'll move to China and start a new job or something. So when I went to start studying psychology, I went from the perspective actually of going towards clinical psychology. So I wanted to help people with mental health problems. I guess when I was in high school, I wanted to do psychology because I wanted to understand people. I've always been fascinated by people. Sometimes you have to be careful, I guess, nowadays. But I always like to look at people if I walk past them in the city or in the village, and just think, what's this person thinking? What was their day like? And I guess that fascination with people and helping people drew me to clinical psychology. But then during my first year of psychology, which was kind of a general introduction to psychology year, I think at some point we had this I don't even remember what it was or when it was, but there was this one person from occupational organizational psychology who I think it was a student, a master's student, and he came to give some kind of guest lecture, or it was this mentoring activity during an outing, and he started speaking about the organizational psychology part, and I was completely fascinated by that. And I kind of there and then decided I'm going to do that direction. I'm going to go towards organizational, so IO psychology, basically. Which is interesting because, as I said, I'm usually not the doing something on a whim, but I'm more of a planning type. So that was actually kind of a positive shock to me. I think that listening to this guy talking about IO psychology in such a passionate voice, and me finding out like, oh, but I can also help people in companies, and then it doesn't have to be kind of the quote unquote negative thing of helping people with mental health problems, but actually helping people perform better. So I think that really fundamentally changed my fascination from trying to fix things that are broken to kind of improving things that are not necessarily broken. So also into the positive psychology, positive OB kind of research, I guess, that I later on went to do my study and PhD in. Yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up in IO psychology.
Okay, interesting. So this idea of moving away from fixing and into improving, which of course had greater applicability, right?
Yeah, definitely.
You could aspire to aim to help everybody to improve, but not everybody fixing.
Yeah.
So interesting. You were giving yourself a bigger audience potentially to work on.
Yeah, well, and also I think it's just, but that's also just a thing I find fundamentally important in that, and I think I found that out during my PhD, which I did among young people with intermediate vocational education, which in my experience is, at least in the Netherlands, is kind of a forgotten group because they're kind of in the middle, so they're not the high potentials and they're not the direct problem at the lower end of the labor market, so they kind of, they have to manage. I think they're still about 50-60% of the Dutch labor market, so it's ridiculous. So that's when I also started really finding out that I truly believe in the fact that we should not just have this exclusive idea of talent management or people development, but that there's so much potential in everyone, and it's, from a management perspective, understandable to invest in the highest potential future leaders, but it's such a shame that there's so much potential to unlock in everyone, and that's something I'm really valuing in this careers research as well.
Okay, fascinating. So tell me a little bit more about this. I mean, you've been working fairly exclusively on the young workforce for quite some time. Has the focus always been on this middle layer of young vocational professionals, or have you looked at other areas, and how did you zero in on this area?
So I would say that when I started my PhD, that was the primary focus. So, and that was actually, to be honest, that was simply a project that got funding, and I applied to the project. Actually, if I'm completely honest, I applied to a project on workaholism first, but there were two candidates that they really wanted, and there was this project. So I said, look, I'll go and do that other project because I think it'll be fun as well. And I've never regretted it a second. I really made a good decision. And so the PhD was really focused on this particular group because I was just really fascinated by how completely ignored they are and how important it is to kind of enhance their employability as well. And I think afterwards, so ever since the PhD was finished, I've broadened my scope a bit. I've retained my passion for the young people, so I'm still doing research on and publishing stuff and giving talks to young people transitioning into employment. But I have also broadened the scope, so I'm also doing research on highly educated young people, but also on not necessarily young people. So I think I've kind of broadened my scope to employability, sustainable career kind of research in general. Also because if you want to talk about sustainability of careers, you cannot only limit yourself to young people. I think it's by definition a dynamic temporal issue. So it would be odd to say, now you're 35 or 30 or whatever the limit is, and now goodbye. Now you no longer belong to my group of interest.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So when you look, let's talk nevertheless for now at the younger end of your spectrum. And what do you think are the most challenging career transitions that they go through?
Well, I mean, if you look at the literature, typically, of course, we tend to look at the school to work transition or university to work transition, college to work transition. There's a lot of different words for it. But essentially, there's a lot of research from different disciplines on this kind of, this big transition from education to working life, essentially. I think research is mostly really centered on this one big transition moment. And I mean, it is a big transition, right? So moving from education into, well, not necessarily full-time employment, can also be self-employment or another type of employment. I think the reason why this is still such a big thing is because it's not just going from a study to a job, it's also adapting your identity, right? You're going from student to worker, or student to entrepreneur, or student to employee. You're getting used to a completely new rhythm. I think especially in higher education, the 2 days a week doing lectures and then going to 70, 80 hours a week working is really fundamentally different way of scheduling your day and having a manager, and not just a professor who says you have a 7 or an 8, but a manager who says you need to do this, otherwise you get a negative performance appraisal. So both practically and like really fundamentally in terms of identity and the vocational identity, it's a really big moment. I would say that if we look at recent literature and also just the recent discourse, also I think professionally, we are seeing that it's kind of changing a bit from this one-off big moment, as if you're jumping from one cliff to the next, crossing the gap, or that it's becoming more of a dynamic process. So for example, we've written this book chapter, I think it'll be published this year, on the idea of that we used to call it occupational choice, right? So in education, you're prepared for a certain occupation, you become a physician or a policeman or, whatever. There's this big transition moment, and then you stay in that occupation for life. So the lifetime employment notion, basically.
Yeah.
And what we argue for in that book chapter is that we're actually changing the perspective from the idea of occupational choice to what we refer to as career crafting. So of course there is a transition, but the transition is actually made up, I think, increasingly of all kinds of micro transitions. So
absolutely, or
even
not
in higher,
micro.
Or not so micro. So many macro could also be big. So some people still have I think we underestimate that as well, by the way. It's a good nuance to make. Some people still have this traditional career, right? So they move into a certain occupation and stay there for life. I think scientists are actually a good example. I see so many of my colleagues, working at a certain university for 20, 25 years. So not so boundaryless as we might, advocate to other people.
No.
But it's an interesting observation. But other people, I think it's already a transition if you're in higher education and you start doing a full-time internship, for example, for a few months. That's already a big transition. Some people transition into paid employment but change jobs like 2 or 3 times within the first 5 years. So then is the transition only first job, or is it actually the first 5 years or 10 years after the first job? And I think disciplines differ. Psychologists tend to look at the first job. Sociologists tend to look at like 10 or 15 years after graduation. However we frame it, it's still a very big moment that causes quite a lot of stress and uncertainty, I think, among students.
Is your subject limited to Dutch children, or young people, or do you study global populations going through these sorts of transitions?
So in terms of the samples I'm studying, it's often been Dutch because that's where I'm from, where I have access to. But I have run several projects with people from the UK, from the US, from all kinds of countries. So, and I think, especially from the conceptual perspective, I think it's applicable to a global population. Although, of course, it is. I think the tricky thing about the school to work transition research and the entire discussion is it is extremely dependent on the educational system and the labor market situation in a
Precisely.
certain
That's
country.
what I was really getting at. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if there are any better examples, any shining examples that you've come across of education systems that help the young person prepare better for that transition instead of making this be the jump off the cliff, but one in which they're exploring how things are going to change and experimenting with them a little bit more before just taking that one isolated jump.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on the country, but also on the type of education you're doing. So if we take the Netherlands as an example, we have higher vocational and university is called higher education, and then there's intermediate vocational, so the more vocationally trained people. And if you look at the vocational training, that's actually I think the connection between the training and the labor market is much stronger than for higher education, which makes sense because it's vocational training and university is not vocational training. But there you see like a lot of students who do like 3 or 4 year vocational training programs, doing a lot of internship, a lot of work experience, and most of them actually working for 3 or 4 days a week and then doing 1 or 2 days of study. So there the transition is much less of a bang, this is one big moment. I think this also is the case in Germany and Switzerland, for example. There's also pretty strong vocational training systems. And in Germany, there's also this system where there's actually, like, I'm not exactly sure, but it's like 2 or 3 years, which are kind of bridge years between study and work. So where you kind of get socialized into the world of work, basically, and then as a jumping off point, start the professional career, like officially. I mean, but then if you compare it to the UK, I've been working with some people who also do a lot of research on kind of graduate employability, which often focuses on how can higher education prepare students to be successful in their transition to employment. And there, I mean, the UK labor market, I think, is quite similar to the US labor market in that the individual agency is super important, right? So being proactive, building your human capital, making sure you have a good resume, even more so than in the Netherlands, I think. So yeah, the topic is really heavily influenced by the context, by the labor market and educational system.
Okay. And now let's turn away from your research in its purest sense and towards your students. I mean, you teach, I don't know how many, but you teach classes in sustainable careers and OB and all kinds of things. So tell me about your students and the kind of work you do with them and the advice you give them as they move into their career choices.
So I think I need to split that up in 2 different stories, because on the one hand, I'm actually most of the teaching I'm doing right now is actually teaching management. So I'm a program director of a business administration master's program. And I think in that program, we've created some really nice opportunities for students to prepare for the transition. So, for example, what we do in that program is we really try to cooperate with businesses very closely. So one of the specialization programs of the business administration is HRM, and there we have, for example, a course where we've worked with Deloitte on a recruitment and selection course. So what the students do is they develop a new selection tool for a current business challenge that Deloitte has, and then the best teams actually get to pitch that new selection tool based on scientific research to the management team or senior HR team of Deloitte. We had another course, talent development and analytics, where students did a research project for Booking.com. And so with these close cooperations, we really try to already show them a bit of, how the corporate world looks like, which they probably will be seeing a lot of in the years after the study. We also have a career services. So we have some people in our faculty who are dedicated to providing workshops on finding an ideal job, crafting the resume, networking. We organize alumni events. So in that sense, we really try to connect the university to the business world and trying to make that transition a bit smoother. In my own teaching, because that's the most direct form of, sharing the research and the passion with the students, of course. I think the thing that I emphasize most is that, find something that fits with who you are. It sounds really cliche, but it's so true. and I mean, I get invited to also to kind of, keynotes and talks for often for young people who are about to make the transition or who have just made the transition.
Yeah.
And for me as a careers researcher, after all these years of research, some things have become very obvious. So the fact that you need to be proactive, that you need to really reflect on who you are, what you're good at. To me, those have become like, yeah, duh. And then when I speak about this with young people, my eyes are opened again. Like, it's not a duh moment for them. I need to be, it's really fascinating to see that if I simply say, well, let me give an example. I had this lecture on recruitment and selection, and in the final lecture, I always tell a bit about my research and I give them some tips for themselves. And so at one point, I basically told the students, look, there's all kinds of rat races with, you need to do an internship, you need to go abroad, you need to do a board membership, you need to do this and this and this. And my advice was, just do what fits you. If it doesn't fit you to go abroad for a year, then don't do it. And then one student said, but Mister, we have to do this. The companies only hire us if we have an internship abroad, if we have a board member year, if we have at least 2 years of relevant working experience. And she was very passionate. And so I looked at her and I said, look, but do you really want to work at that company if they ask all of these things without good reason, basically? And then she fell completely silent for a few seconds and was like, you saw this, her thoughts going like, oh wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. And I think that is one of the things I really try to achieve. So to really have them think about these issues and not take stuff for granted, because companies saying you need to do, 20 different things in order to be eligible to be hired by us, it's the result of a rat race of, mass higher education. We're going towards, I think, almost 40% highly educated people in the Netherlands. I spoke to some people in Finland recently. They're already around 50%. So half of the population is highly educated. So what do companies do? They look for new ways to find excellence, because a Master's of Science degree is no longer enough.
Yeah.
So you need a Master's of Science degree and a board membership and internships and work experience, because they want to get the best of the best.
Absolutely.
And it's understandable from their perspective. But it's also, I think, one of the reasons why we're seeing so many health-related and stress-related problems among students, because the pressure just keeps rising and rising and rising. And I think that's something that I talk about with students a lot. So and especially also in today's labor market, which is quite good, I think, for graduates.
Yeah.
Also make sure that you realize that you have value for the company. So it's not just being happy that they want to hire you.
Yeah.
They should also be happy that you want to work for them.
Yeah.
That's also surprisingly always to me, but it's a big eye opener for them. And it's like, oh wow,
it's extraordinary. I mean, when I coach young graduates, I often use metaphors that they initially find uncomfortable, but I tell them that this whole process is like dating and then getting serious and eventually getting married. And then they start to see that balance might just be a bit more important than they imagined, because it was all about sort of thinking that they have to beg like a little puppy to be given the privilege of a job. And yet you're absolutely right. This idea of fit and mutual appreciation is so absolutely crucial, and I think very much societally ignored. Society is full of, you should do this, you should achieve that. And in order, as you say, in order to achieve that, then you have to have got all these criteria lined up. And of course, if you do educate 50% of the 50% of the population highly, they can't possibly all go and work at McKinsey.
No, exactly. So I think that's one of the big problems right now. And of course, if you look at it more from an ethical perspective, with two colleagues from KU Leuven in Belgium, Anneleen Fourier and Nele de Kuiper, we published a provocation paper in Human Resource Management Journal a few months ago. And one of the things we're saying, so this was a provocation on employability research, which has also been extremely focused on agency, right? So individual ownership, and you can be employable and successful if you just want and if you put the effort in. And one of the arguments we made in that provocation paper was, it's also potentially quite polarizing to think this way, because Well, first of all, the question is, can everyone become employable? Is it simply something makeable? Can you just generate it? I'm not sure.
Mm.
But there's also the risk from an ethical perspective. There's a big risk on what we call a Matthew effect, right? So the strong get stronger and the weak get weaker,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. So what happens is, the students that are already privileged, or have the luck that they have the quickest learners, or they had this nice opportunity to work at a big employer, they get hired in the traineeships are the direct route for future management positions. They get all the investments, and so the people who already have the resources get even more resources. The people who lack the resources go into protection mode, but because they go into protection mode, they actually lose even more resources instead of gaining additional ones. And we also see that, for example, in science, so in academia. So we have, of course, one of the things that has become much more important in recent years is grant money. So universities need external funding, so people are encouraged to get as much grant money as possible, which has become hyper competitive. And so what we're seeing is that, as an example, in our country, we have this what we call Veni Vidi Vici funding scheme. And the Veni is the first one. It's a 250,000 euros. It's basically what it means. If you get it, you can do 80% research for 3 or 4 years. So it's a really nice opportunity to really specialize and get some high level work out there. It was originally meant for young scholars who kind of need the final push. So, for example, postdocs who don't have any job security, and they can really use those 3 years to publish some work and get into an assistant professor position. And what has happened often, and I think they're trying to change it now, so I'm hoping actually that this becomes a new trend. But what we've seen in the past is that they give this grant to people who are actually already established, right? So tenured assistant and associate professors get this grant because they have the biggest publication lists, because they might have already gotten a grant before, because they had the best supervisors. And while it's understandable because they are a safe bet to put the money in, because they will deliver, it's also, from a Matthew effect principle, a bit tricky, because they would have been successful without this extra resource of a grant as well, but they get it, so they become even more successful. And then afterwards we say, look, it was a good choice, look how successful they are. And to the other people we say, look, you really need to publish more. But if they would have gotten the grant, maybe they would have been at that stage as well. So I think that's a tricky thing in terms of company responsibility, but in this case also who do we give the grants to? How inclusive and exclusive are the policies that we use? It's I think in general in careers research we've really overemphasized this notion of individual agency, which is very important. Don't get me wrong. I do research on career competencies, on employability, on career crafting. So of course your career is your own, so you need to craft it. But I think we've kind of been ignoring the context for quite a while. And I mean, looking at these examples and also what we discussed in terms of educational systems and labor markets, it is so fundamental to careers that it cannot be overlooked, in my opinion.
So what do you think that companies or employing organizations can do to make it easier or better or smoother, not only for people to move into their organizations, but to craft their own career within that organization?
Well, I mean, one obvious one, of course, is that it's I think for a large part also HR's responsibility, right? I mean, if we look at like 30 years ago, like if you look at the careers research, but also just the professional way of doing things, organizational career management, so taking care of your workers was kind of the dominant paradigm. And so it's actually quite odd that we all say that careers are becoming more complex, more dynamic, more flexible, in short, more difficult.
Yes.
But then at the same time, we also say, and now it's all your own responsibility. So it's becoming much more difficult, but we're no longer helping you. To me, it's a paradox. And I think we need to reconcile the paradox in some way. And one thing is to, simply continue to invest in people and not just exclusively in a few high potentials. But, I would say more inclusively. And I think it's becoming a trend, though. I think in the talent management literature, it's slowly becoming a more dominant part of the discourse that we want to move towards more inclusive talent management policies. And I think that's one of the key things to help young people develop their employability. I think one of the reasons why it has not happened so much is because a lot of employers are afraid that the best people will leave. It's what we call the employability paradox.
Sure.
So if we invest in people, won't they leave?
Yeah.
But actually, what we're finding thus far in our research is that it's not the case. So there's some people from the KU Leuven again who've done research on this employability management paradox. Christine Philippaars has done some research, for example. And what they're showing is that investments in employability, well, it's actually, especially in terms of internal employability, they tend to strengthen actually commitment to the employer. Mm-hmm. And at least it doesn't seem to hurt commitment. So making people more employable also from an external perspective. So basically the marketability.
Sure.
What we're finding is that it's not necessarily leading people to, wanting to leave the organization or actually leaving the organization. And what we did in a study, I think it'll be published next week. We also studied a similar model where we looked at different HR practices, how they would impact commitment to the employer via employability. So basically what we said is employers can invest in training, in communication, and in performance appraisals. How will that impact the perceptions of people's employability and subsequently their commitment to the organization? Mm-hmm. And what we find is that especially communication, but to a somewhat lesser degree also training practices, they enhance both types of employability, so both internally to the current employer and externally to potential other employers. And the internal employability enhances commitment, and the external employability at least does not harm commitment. So making people more employable doesn't make them less committed to the employer. And our explanation is actually classic social exchange theory. So if my employer invests in my development, that's a sign of commitment from them to me, and then I am, I tend to reciprocate the favor. So they trust me, so I will trust them back. And what we also said is it's both in terms of looking back, so they have invested in me, so I will invest back in them. But it's also kind of a future, a forward-looking exchange, right? So if they've invested in me, there's a pretty good chance they will continue to take care of me. They will continue to offer me opportunities to develop myself. And so it's actually in my own best interest to remain with the company. And of course, some people will leave, but some people will leave anyway. Right? There's always, I think, a healthy amount of turnover in companies. Yes. But if the turnover happens everywhere, then highly talented people will come back to your organization just as much as they will leave.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a lot that HR can do in terms of training, participation, those kinds of practices, and of course, especially the talent management policies.
Absolutely. One question that we often come across when working with our clients is that of where does the responsibility of HR stop, and where should managers of any size of team be picking up and carrying that, human capital development, call it what you want, ball, and making it part of their responsibility.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've seen any wonderful examples of where the best parts of the HR strategy are trickling down efficiently into the organization, and everybody takes responsibility for making talent management happen in their units.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure if I have I've seen some examples, but to be honest, mostly that happens in small organizations who don't have the very long history and the big bureaucratic structure. So I do know of one example, but that's, again, it's a pretty small company, I think about 20 people there, who basically said, we're going to throw all the systems overboard, and now we're going to decide together as a team on budgets, on salaries, on performance appraisals, on holidays, on basically everything. So they kind of don't have management, but they manage themselves, which I think is, in terms of taking responsibility and ownership for their development, that's best practice, I think, because you see, to me, it was surprising that it worked. And I think in a bigger organization, it will be difficult, because the more people are added, at some point, conflict is bound to arise. It's impossible, there has to be, and I think people inherently also need some kind of management structure to kind of tell them what they're doing right and possibly wrong. But that's a nice example to see how people like an entire team is taking ownership of their own development and their own productivity and performance, basically. I think, especially in the bigger corporates, unfortunately, it too often happens that, HR and business do not necessarily align because they have different interests, right? Because the business usually tends to look at short-term gains, and the HR looks at long-term human capital gains, so to speak. So, I always hope that our HR graduates, so many of them who become, HRBP, so HR business partners in a number of years, I hope that they will become kind of the linking pins between HR and the business, so that because they speak the HR language, they also speak the business language. And I think there's a very important role for especially the HRBPs to make this connection between the ideas and the policies and the practices that HR comes up with versus, a manager who might not think that sustainable employability is all that important because he just wants people to be productive because, they need to be a productive team who make, a lot of profit, for example. So I'm not sure if I don't have any very clear example of it working, but I do see some of our graduates moving into this business partner role and trying to, really acting as the linking pin between both worlds, so to speak.
Yeah, that offers hope then, I guess.
Yes.
And I wasn't honestly really expecting you to have 10 brilliant examples of how the coexistence works in harmony and creates even better organizations. But let's hope that the generations that you're educating now and that we're coaching or consulting with will eventually have an impact and make it more harmonious. Okay. Now, what about in your university? Students get your classes, they go through their business management education, and you've mentioned that you have a whole set of advisors who may or may not be faculty. I'm not sure if I remember that rightly, who then give good or some career advice. Tell me about how that works and how you would hope it would evolve in the future.
Well, I think in general, we've seen that the importance of preparing students for the labor market in universities has become much more important. So I think traditionally universities didn't really, commit too much to that because, we're universities, so an academic institution. So, and I always tell our students, we don't necessarily prepare you for a job, but we do prepare you for a career, right? So I think especially university graduates, they don't necessarily have all the job skills when they start, but they do have the critical thinking skills and the reflection skills and the professional social skills to develop into these roles and ultimately have a high ceiling. And I think if I look at our own programs in our School of Business and Economics, that it has really become much more important to help prepare students, also in terms of formal evaluations. So in terms of accreditation of our programs, in terms of the Dutch National Student Evaluation, which is a pretty big thing here. The transition to and preparation for the labor market is becoming an important indicator of quality of education. To me, that's a good thing. Because I think, even though we're an academic institution, less than 1% of our graduates go into a PhD. So all of them almost go into business. And so there should be preparation. So the career services, I think that's what you're referring to. That's, I think, one of the big formal improvements that have been made in recent years. I think we have them for about 4 or 5 years now. So basically, they're a team of career specialists who work for our entire faculty. And they have all kinds of workshops. So they have both general workshops for the entire school. For example, on a CV training or social media profile training, or crack the case workshops to kind of help students prepare for the thinking that the businesses do, but also tailored workshops. So they also try to do some workshops specifically, for example, for strategic management students or for accounting students or marketing students. So really kind of digging into the themes that are important for those specific disciplines. And I think it's becoming more and more successful. So what we saw in the first few years is that the initiative was wonderful, but many students just didn't go. Right? Because especially at the first part of the program, there's not really a sense of urgency yet. And so there's all these workshops, but only 10 people show up.
Sure.
And I think especially in the past 2 years, we've been trying to incorporate some of those workshops in the program. So sometimes during some of the courses, they actually have a role in those courses to provide, for example, a workshop. In one of the first HR courses, there's a workshop on defining your ideal job. So students really think about what kind of characteristics should their ideal job have, so they can use that during their master's year to kind of craft their study program and kind of, possibly an internship or whatever they decide to do. So I think the workshops are what they do mostly now, but it's also organizing certain events, for example. So we usually have alumni events where like 10 to 15 alumni from a certain specialization program come back to the university and share some of their experiences with the new students, which I think is always a very inspiring session. Fun to see the graduates again for me,
sure.
And for them to see us again, but also really valuable for the new students to hear, how did they experience the program? How did they experience their first job?
Concrete.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that this service is really of a big added value to help students, get a bit of a sense of the skills and et cetera that they need for the working life. And as I mentioned before, we also try to do it to really incorporate it more in the courses. So we try to have projects that are related to companies. Sometimes we go to the companies for lectures. Sometimes they come to us. There's a possibility for accredited internship in the program. And so we're trying to create a lot of different ways for them to also build their professional skills already during the program besides the academic skills.
Perfect.
Does that answer the question?
It does. It absolutely does. Now, I'd like to turn the tables and talk a little bit about your own career, because you do a lot more than just teaching and researching in a university. You write, you're on boards, and you even had a 15-year career as a dance teacher. So I'd love to understand how you juggle all of that and how you have managed your own career.
Yeah, well, so yes, if you put it like that, I guess I'm doing a lot of different things at the same time, right? Well, I think part of that story is also it's just me. I think in one of the things we advocate in our research on sustainable careers is that one of the key things to have a good career and sustainable career is find this person career fit. So do things that fit with who you are, the things that you like, the things that you're good at. And for me, I've always been kind of a busy person. I like when I do many things. I would not want to do 100% research. I would not want to do 100% teaching. I would not want to do 100% consulting. I actually really like the diversity of my job, and that I'm lecturing students one day, writing a really cool paper the other day, being at a business for a keynote yet another day, going to a conference in the US the week after. To me, that kind of dynamic existence is what makes my job so much fun. But I also know that there's people who would be completely burnt out or stressed with this juggling of activities, and they actually really want to focus on either the research or the business or the teaching. So I guess that's one important thing to say, kind of a disclaimer to say. It just fits with who I am.
Your own personality and your own particular dynamic and aspirations.
Yeah, and I think it's always been that way. So so I think I was a dancing teacher for about 15 years, which was kind of just a hobby that went, it turned into a kind of a side job, so to speak. So at one point, I think when I was doing my PhD, at one point I was at like 4 evenings in the week that I was teaching people how to dance. So that was like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, sometimes even Sunday.
Yeah.
And my promoters, my supervisors always used to say, quit the dancing stuff. It's only distracting you. And I said, no, it's actually enriching me, because those are the moments that I don't think about my work and that I get new energy because I'm actively doing stuff. My work is with the head. The dancing is also, entertaining people. I love music. I love dancing. So actually that kind of, it energized me. And I think it's made me into who I am, because I've learned the pedagogical skills at university, but where it's like 80% content and 20% trying to have students enjoy themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the other way around in the dancing school, where people pay to have fun, so it's 80% entertainment and 20% making sure you explain stuff right. Yeah. And I think that crossover has really helped me to, become who I am today. And I really enjoy doing talks and lectures and keynotes. I think partially because of that crossover of different types of teaching skills, so to speak.
Sure, teaching skills and possibly even entertainment, right? If you get involved in the dance world, the performing world, then potentially you become a better, more pleasurable performer yourself.
I think it helps because people actually it was funny because people in the dancing school used to say, I mean, you can explain things so clearly, but that was simply, then I said, well, tomorrow I'm teaching students on motivation theory, so I need to be able to explain self-determination or whatever. Yeah. And then, at the university, they always said, you're so relaxed and you're at least trying to crack some jokes, once in a while. And that's actually because, in the dancing school, you're trying to, make people have a nice time. So it really helped me to develop kind of, well, you could say interdisciplinary skills. That sounds cool,
yes,
right?
Yes, it sounds very fancy.
and like overall, I think it just shows that I'm a very busy person so we quit the dancing because my wife was in the final years of being a dancing teacher. My wife was teaching with me. But then at one point when our first child was born, it became ridiculous to have a full-time job. And I usually work for 70, 80 hours a week easily. And then have a few evenings in the week to do, and the kid, that was too much. So then I would say, my son, and now I also have a young daughter of 4 months. So now that's kind of taking up, a lot of really nice time. But still, as you mentioned, so I have a lot of research projects. I do some consulting work. I'm teaching. I'm program director of a business administration program. So yeah, there's a lot of different things, and to me, it's what makes my work enjoyable. But I've also learned to prioritize and set boundaries, because I used to be someone, just fun, yeah, let's do it, bang, and then I'd go for it, and then at one point it was like, now I said yes to 20 things, now I have a problem.
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to learn, I would say, or I'm continuing to learn how to juggle those activities effectively, and to sometimes say no, or to sometimes have one, myself leading one research project and then a colleague leading the other research project, because you cannot lead all of them. So the enthusiasm that I have in me is also something that I need to channel a bit more effectively, and I think I'm getting better at it.
Okay, great. That's really, really interesting, and we could talk for hours about this, but we won't. I guess a question moving towards the end of our talk today is about whether, you've shared all kinds of insight from your own research, from other research that's coming out as important at the moment. Is there anything else exciting and important that you would be sharing about research at this stage?
So, I think most of the research I'm doing is quite, exciting. So it's difficult to choose.
Yes. If you had to pick one further highlight to tell us about.
Well, what I do want to share is that so since a few years I've been working on this research on sustainable careers. A lot of it has been done with Beatrice van der Heijden from Nijmegen and Ans de Vos from Antwerp in Belgium. And what we've done is we've we just published this conceptual paper where we try to frame a model of what sustainable careers could look like. And we're finding out it's quite difficult. Because when is a career sustainable? I think one of the conclusions we've already drawn is you can never say your career is sustainable. You can only assess someone's sustainability at a certain point in time, but it's inherently a dynamic process. Mm-hmm. But what I really like about our thinking in this sustainable career paradigm is that we're saying, we've been looking too much at only the individual. If you look at the dominant career theories of the past 20, 25 years, they have been extremely valuable. They've taught us a lot of very interesting knowledge about how careers develop. But I do think that they focused very much on the agency perspective. It's about the Protean career focusing on self-development, on self-awareness, on kind of, self-actualization, if you want to put it that way, even though, of course, Maslow's theory is not very valid. But, let's use this term for once. Yeah. Boundaryless career theory, which is focused very much on, physical and psychological mobility and, being flexible across organizational boundaries. Mm. And most of it has really focused on make sure you're proactive, craft your career, and then you'll be successful. Yeah. And what we're doing with the sustainable careers that we're explicitly saying, sustainability, which we frame as kind of being happy, healthy, and productive in your work over time, is predicted by the interplay between the person in their context over time. So yes, we do start with the individual. For example, the career competencies they're building, the career adaptability they have developed, the meaningfulness they can create in their work. But the individual always acts within a certain occupational, national context, certain organizational context, the work-home context, and those all impact on, you can say, develop your career competencies, which I've done a lot of research on, and I think especially for the graduates, it's super valuable. We're showing that in a whole series of studies. But then it's different for a knowledge worker versus, a factory worker. It's different for blue collar, white collar. It's different for Dutch versus Chinese versus US versus, whatever country or culture or. And then we say we also need to look at things that happen over time. People's motivations change, right? In the early career versus late career. Things happen. So I think I mentioned at the start of our talk, this research I'm doing on career shocks right now. Yes. And I'm really excited about that as well, because we've also overlooked that. So in focusing so much on agency, we've kind of said careers are kind of makeable, right? You can control everything, and if you're unsuccessful, it's your fault. But actually, if you talk to people about their careers, almost everyone has one or two or three defining moments. Something happened and your career changed, or at least it got you thinking. In the past 20 years, almost no one has researched these career shocks. And a few years ago, when I started reading up on this topic, I thought there can be two reasons for this. The first one is it's simply not interesting. The second one is it's too difficult. And I'm finding out it's the second one. It's really difficult to do research on career shocks because, first of all, if you really want to study their effects, you would have to, catch people in the act of having a shock, which is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So it's also going to be some kind of retrospective research.
Sure.
And it's also tricky, especially in a quantitative way. It's tricky because there are so many different aspects of shocks. There's is it a positive or a negative shock, the valence. There's frequency. Maybe there's one super big shock, or there's another shock that happens 5 times and comes up to a certain threshold before it's really impacting your career. There's the duration. Some are very short, some are very long. Yeah. Some happen in private life, some happen in professional life. And so what we try to do to kind of get this research rolling is last year with Scott Siebert from the US and Stefan Moll from the University of Amsterdam, so the other Amsterdam University. We wrote a conceptual piece in the South African Journal of Industrial Psychology in which we provide a kind of a definition and defining characteristics of career shocks. And I think and I hope that will become kind of a starting point for people to start researching these shocks and these chance events again, because it's such an important part of how people's careers evolve. And even though we cannot predict them, we can help people prepare for shocks that might occur frequently for certain types of people in certain times in their career. And I think if we understand the shocks better, we can also learn how to help people cope with those shocks, right?
Absolutely.
And of course, from a scientific perspective, it's simply interesting to understand it. So, so early this year, a PhD student that I'm supervising published this paper in Journal of Vocational Behavior, in which we showed that so this was among young professionals, in which we showed that young professionals who develop their career competencies subsequently feel more successful in their career and then also feel more employable towards the future. But that this, what we call the agentic pathway, because, build your competencies, be successful, be employable, that agentic pathway is actually strengthened when people experience more positive shocks, like unexpected promotions, and it's weakened when they experience more negative shocks, such as being laid off, having a mentor suddenly leave the organization, having a close relative suddenly pass away. So we clearly show there that for these young professionals, these kinds of shocks have a big impact on how the career evolves. And so I'm really excited about these so career shocks as part of the sustainability perspective. And I'm hoping that this will be I think that will be one of the key things that I'm investing in the next few years.
That's fantastic and very, very apt, as it really shows an area in which your work as a scientific researcher and our work as consultants and storytellers actually completely coincide, because the book we wrote, the work we continue to do, is all about disrupting career, whether disrupting it for yourself or being disrupted in other way. The stories we tell, the anecdotes that we've derived from the wisdom of 50 or so leaders across the world in their stories, and those at moments that you call shocks, that we might call triggers or other things, it really have been superb in terms of the learning we've been able to derive from them, and the advice that we're thus able to give to both individuals and organizations about how better to take the energy of the shock, whatever it is, and turn it into something positive for the future, rather than it being a negative path and leaving it that way.
Yeah. That's I mean, and that's what makes the job so much fun, right? I mean, to me, especially the research I'm doing is so applied, and it's really fun to see these connections. And sometimes people say, but what, it's not surprising what you say about, develop your career competencies or something. And I'm saying, well, but that's exactly what I hope, because that means it's relevant, right? If I'm saying something and you as a consultant or a coach would say, well, I mean, that's something I've never thought of, or that's completely stupid. I mean, then the disconnect only grows. So I think I'm really happy to hear that you're recognizing these issues, and that I think we can help each other in that regard. And that
I was thinking, I'm sure there's some overlap here, and we should be continuing this discussion offline.
Yeah.
But on that note, I suspect it's probably time to recognize that time has passed. It's been absolutely fascinating. I would happily stick around all day and chat about this stuff because I love it. Antoine, my co-author, of course, isn't here in our Skype conversation, but I know he's here with us in spirit. We're both absolutely fascinated and excited by this area, and delighted that you've shared so much insight with us today. And I really do genuinely suspect that we should be meeting and talking and exploring how we can combine our work and see what insight we can share with each other and the greater world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you very, very much, Jos. It's been a true pleasure. And
pleasure was all mine.
The dialogue outside this space.
All right, we'll do that.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much, Jos.